The Trump administration is radically reshaping America and the world around it. In the inaugural Vantage Point essay from Australia Institute Press, Dr Emma Shortis examines Trump's grim vision for America and the future of the Australia-US alliance. Pre-order your copy of After America, Australia and the New World Order, or become a Foundation subscriber to Vantage Point at australiainstitute.org.au/store or via the link in the show notes.
After America is made on the lands of the Kure-Wurrung, Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples. We acknowledge that they and their ancestors have cared for the lands, rivers and sea, and all living creatures for thousands of generations. We pay our respects to elders past and present and acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded.
We are in a battle for the soul of America.
This is a fraud on the American public.
Welcome to After America. I'm Emma Shortis, Director of International and Security Affairs at the Australia Institute. As we get ever closer to the 100th day of the Trump administration, the white men in the White House continue to implement their radical agenda for a dramatically transformed United States. On Thursday, Australian time, another executive order dropped. This one, deceptively titled Restoring Equality of Opportunity and Meritocracy, marks the beginning of what will be a new wave of attacks on modern America, specifically on the 1964 Civil Rights Act. Trump and the movement that supports him have always seen his victory in November as a generational one, as an opportunity to undo all of the gains of the civil rights movement and return to an imaginary version of America in which white people, specifically straight white men, are the rightful and natural leaders of society. The movement behind Trump, the kind of men who write these executive orders, represent a deeply racist, misogynist and anti-democratic ideology that intends to impose the will of the minority over the lives of the majority. This week, to look at how this is all playing out in real time, we welcome back friend of the show, Dr Prudence Flowers. Prudence is Senior Lecturer in the College of Humanities, Arts and Social Sciences at Flinders University and President of the Australian and New Zealand American Studies Association. We spoke about how Trump's ideas about masculinity inform his approach to economic policy, the link between that and his administration's attacks on trans people and reproductive rights, and much more besides. Here's Prudence now. Hi, Prudence. Welcome back to the show.
Hi, Emma. It's great to be here.
It's always fun, hey? So, Prudence, I have to start in the obvious spot. We've been talking about tariffs a lot, obviously, but I know you'll have a really unique perspective on them, partly because you've just finished a book on Ronald Reagan and the 1980s. So I wanted to ask you, what's your take on the tariffs?
One of the things I think is really interesting about tariffs is that they show this kind of very stark division that's emerging amongst Republicans. And I think we can see that both in the way that contemporary Republicans and conservatives have reacted to the tariffs, but also if we look at the history of modern conservatism. So Reagan very famously pioneered free trade agreements.
We're reminding the world that, yes, we all have serious problems, but our economic system, based on individual freedom, private initiative, and free trade, has produced more human progress than any other in history. When other countries don't grow, they buy less from us, and we see fewer jobs created at home. When we don't grow, we buy less from them, which weakens their economies and, of course, their ability to buy from us. It's a vicious cycle.
Which was actually kind of controversial at the time. So people like Newt Gingrich, quite famous conservatives, didn't like free trade agreements. But Reagan is the reason that we have things like NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement with Canada and Mexico. Reagan pioneered kind of free trade agreements. The first country he struck one with was Israel. And this was a real shift in US thinking around trade, where protectionism had always been kind of part and parcel of the mix. So Republicans very famously implemented significant tariffs during the Great Depression. The Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, which famously made the Great Depression worse globally, was a protectionist measure. But after Reagan, even though you still see some kind of interventions to protect certain industries, particularly against Japanese manufacturing and whatnot, you do start to see this kind of broader shift away from protectionist initiatives like this. And so I think what's striking about this is this pivot of, 40 years of a neoliberal consensus around the centrality of free trade to global commerce. And now you see Trump reverting to a much more kind of 1920s mode of thinking about the economy.
Yeah, it is a pretty remarkable shift amongst a number of remarkable shifts. But I think the other thing that really stands out to me in this administration's approach to trade and the economy, and I'm almost certain it stands out to you as well, is just how deeply linked it all is to Trump and I guess the broader conservative movements thinking about gender and about masculinity in particular.
I think probably the best example of that has been a couple of Trump's public performances of masculinity around economic issues. So, for example, at the Liberation Day event, he had invited a subset of United Auto Workers to be part of the audience. And there's this kind of scene where he throws out Make America Great hats to them and is really clear that he's not giving those to the politicians, that they're for the auto workers. Mm. And similarly, there was an event he had which was about restoring coal mining, essentially. And there's this kind of striking visual of him on stage surrounded by coal miners, all kitted out in their coal mining kit. And in his way of talking about them, he's framing them as, you know, these kind of burly, strong men. Like he was sort of joking about whether or not he could arm wrestle them, whether or not the podium that they were on would collapse from their weight because they're so muscular. But there's also this kind of framing where he's saying that these men only want to mine coal. That was how he was talking about it. And he kind of made fun of Hillary Clinton's initiatives back in 2016 to kind of retrain people from coal mining towns. And I think what we see here are two really stark narratives. So on the one hand, the vision of the tariffs is often framed as though it's going to return particularly kind of manufacturing industry that really started to vanish from the US in the 1970s and 1980s. And it's worth noting that the vanishing of those industries was very much associated with the neoliberalism of someone like Ronald Reagan and free trade policies. So he's not actually wrong in blaming free trade policies for the vanishing of those jobs. He's proposing to return to a kind of manufacturing and industrial ideal that has not been present really in the US since about the mid-1970s to early 1980s. And a kind of return to those types of areas of employment. But, you know, just as an aside, many of the people who try to defend the tariffs, when they talk about the factories that will return, it's not those kind of manufacturing jobs. It's things like tech manufacturing, quite fiddly, quite precise manufacturing, not the kind of burly cartoon strongman manufacturing that Trump associates himself with. But then you start to see this division where, because a lot of Trump's public statements around the tariffs emphasize this lost masculine ideal of the kind of mid-20th century, that's a vision that some of his supporters have really lent into as being about restoring manliness itself. So there's this kind of theme of make men manly again, so a play on the MAGA thing. And lots of his, I guess you could say, more Fox News type acolytes have really said things in response to the tariff which defended them as a way of re-masculinizing men. So some of the greatest hits, I think the best one came from the Fox News host, Jesse Waters, who essentially said that if you sit behind a screen and work with women, you become estrogenized. So basically anyone engaged in white-collar work, or dare I say tech bro work, is inherently feminized. So on the one hand, the tariffs are supposed to return to men this kind of opportunity to work only with other men, which is kind of part of what Jesse Waters is saying, to not have to deal with screens, which feminizes and kind of neuters them in some way. The tariffs are going to get them back in the factories, supposedly doing brawny, burly work. And this is the kind of language that's used. But simultaneously, the other portion of Trump's supporters, and dare I say the slightly more influential supporters, were very, very alarmed by the tariffs.
This is a behind-the-scenes rivalry that's now exploding into public view.
Between Peter Navarro, who is perhaps the biggest cheerleader for tariffs in the White House, and of course Elon Musk.
Musk, meanwhile, just posted on X, quote, Navarro is truly a moron. What he says here is demonstrably false.
Musk actually referred to Navarro today as being, quote, dumber than a sack of bricks. Are you at all, or is the administration, the president, at all concerned that this is maybe impacting the public's understanding of these tariffs? It might be messing with the message on it?
No, look, these are obviously two individuals who have very different views on trade and on tariffs. Boys will be boys.
Because for those people who are wealthy, so people like Joe Rogan, for people like the tech bros, the incredible decimation of the US economy that happened with the stock market crash is deeply alarming. And they also, I think, have an understanding that the factories are not coming back anytime soon. So most commentaries sort of say no factory is coming back in this term of Trump's administration. They would want to ride this out and see what happens. And if factories do return in some kind of way, it will probably take a decade for the most of them to kind of get up and running again, and they're not going to be the kind of jobs that people talk about when they're talking about, the Detroit auto industry or things like that. It is going to be the fiddly kind of iPhone construction labor, which of course led to various Chinese social media accounts making quite insulting images of obese Americans trying to screw together phones. So there's this kind of, what kind of jobs would the tariffs bring to America? And I think there's this incredible kind of fantasy around what society would look like if the tariffs were effective. And this fantasy is about a society that hasn't existed for decades and cannot come back in many ways.
But I mean, that doesn't mean that they're not going to continue to aspire to that kind of society, which, exactly as you say, has this kind of vision of the nuclear family with the big, strong man off in coal mines earning a living wage that then supports the rest of his family, the wife at home.
Except the interesting thing is, a lot of the fantasies around gender that these people publicly endorse, at least, still doesn't fit with that. The fantasy of gender they have, which is a very specific kind of post-World War II nuclear family fantasy, was actually when men were entering white-collar work, that when men become middle class, there's still lots of factory work and there's good union jobs, but this is also the moment when you start to see the movement of men into the professional classes, into white-collar work. It was much remarked upon as a potential crisis around masculinity then. There's a famous movie, The Man in the Grey Flannel Suit, with Gregory Peck, which was based on a novel, which was all about the ways in which officers unmanned people, but also made you an anonymous member of the crowd. So these concerns that seem so present now are the exact concerns people had in the 1950s, because actually this kind of vision of the coal mining father supporting his family, that does not reflect what Appalachian or kind of working class life was like. And many of the women, the wives of coal miners worked and children worked, if we're going back earlier. Yeah. So again, it's this kind of vision, it's never existed in history, which I think makes the kind of repetition of certain concerns, the kind of psychic concern around American men losing their vigor, particularly interesting.
Yeah, interesting is the word.
Yeah,
and with the Trump administration and the broader movement that supports him, one of the psychic concerns, which I think is a really nice way of describing it, is also around gender and trans people in particular. And, I think from what you're saying, it's fairly clear that the attacks on trans people by the Trump administration and the broader movement are very much part of this fantasy vision of gender hierarchies in the United States.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, on the to be clear, trans people have always existed, whether they use that kind of language or not. So there's, again, this kind of fantasy around gender and sexuality that I think is quite striking. And I think it's very fair to say that trans people function here as the kind of canary in the coal mine for a kind of heterosexual imperative more broadly. And so I do, again, want to reiterate, I think it's notable that someone like Milo Yiannopoulos, probably the most prominent alt-right gay guy, is now advocating for conversion therapy and touts himself as an ex-gay. So there's, I think what we'll start to see, and here I was thinking about the fact that Peter Thiel, the tech bro backer of people like J.D. Vance, quite influential on Elon Musk and Doge, I remember him in 2016 speaking at the Republican the Republican National Convention, kind of imploring Republicans not to go down an anti-gay path. I think what we're seeing here is that trans people have, again, under Trump, been subject to this wholesale attack. And I think depending on the success of this attack, we'll start to see slippage of this kind of language and policing and rhetoric into non-heterosexual sexual orientation and formation. Because there's been this huge sweep almost as soon as Trump took office of anti-trans actions. And I think one of the things that's quite interesting here is they were very, very high priority, I think, in terms of the way Trump himself framed them. And whereas once we might have seen lots of anti-abortion initiatives being signed by Trump on the first day, really there was just kind of one big hodgepodge thing, whereas he signed multiple different executive orders around trans issues in his first few days. And, again, to remind people about the election, Trump backers poured over $200 million just into anti-trans advertising in swing states. And the real message was about, and this is the quote, Kamala is for they, them, President Trump is for you. So this kind of idea, and I think that's important if we talk about Peter Dutton, this idea that pronouns were themselves woke, this kind of idea that trans people who are about 0.5% of the population with this existential threat has been carried over into all these kind of conflicting executive orders to do with trans women having to be moved into men's federal prisons, that now all federal documentation, but particularly passports, have to display either female or male markers for sex, and you can't change that, that gender-affirming care for trans youth must be completely cut if it's federally supported, that schools need to stop indoctrinating young people, bars on transgender people in the military. Like, some of this he did first term, some of it he just talked about doing. But you also see things like the National Park Service rewrote the National Park Service page for Stonewall, which is a historic site, which was in 1969. That's where the first queer rights event happened, to remove all reference to trans people who were really prominently part of that event. So in front of us, history is being rewritten and reshaped to make the existence of trans people seem like a kind of contemporary blip or a modern fashion. J.D. Vance infamously went on Rogan during the campaign and claimed that white middle-class people were identifying as non-binary to get advantage to get into elite universities. Like, this kind of idea that trans people want to mutilate children, or that trans affirming care is mutilation. This is the language that's used. And all of this, again, is about shaping a kind of vision of who is American and who is not American. But it's also about framing people as essentially perverts, which is how the anti-gay agenda worked in the 70s and 80s and 90s, was this very explicit association between same-sex attraction and pedophilia, which was advanced by a lot of the religious right groups. So there's this kind of sense in which it's a canary in the coal mine situation, that they're testing out what they can do with this particularly vulnerable population. And, they have reason to know that they can go really far on this issue, because even before Trump, even before the second term, you had all the bathroom bans and the bans on trans people in sport, which Trump has also passed some kind of decree around that. And it's estimated there were it was under 1,000 people were part of that ban, but as Republicans claimed it as a major victory.
In a few moments, I'll sign a historic executive order to ban men from competing in women's sports. Under the Trump administration, we will defend the proud tradition of female athletes, and we will not allow men to beat up, injure, and cheat our women and our girls.
This kind of idea that trans people are a threat. And what I think is particularly interesting is that the way that Trump frames trans people is to focus exclusively on trans women and to frame what he's doing as protecting women. This is very explicit language that he uses, that they need to protect women from predatory trans women, which is the kind of paternalistic vision that feeds exactly into how things like Project 2025 talks about the family and gender roles, that it is the role of a male head of household to protect his family and to protect the women and children in it.
Prudence, there's so much to unpack in that. You mentioned Peter Dutton, of course, and reproductive rights. But just before we get to that point, I wanted to ask you about some of the international repercussions of these attacks on trans people, because I know and I've seen cases of trans people, queer people wanting to travel to the United States, sometimes for academic conferences or whatever, and deciding against it or being advised against it. And given your expertise on this and also your own position as an academic who often goes to the States, how do you see all of that playing out?
I think it's been interesting that several European countries have essentially now issued directives to trans and intersex people, or anyone with an X marker in their passport rather than M and female, to directly seek advice from the US Embassy. So already multiple European countries have essentially been telling trans people that they shouldn't travel until they've sought advice. And to be honest, I don't really know how helpful that is, given that we're seeing these stories about the incredible discretionary powers of individual border agents. And, there've been repeated reports around British and Australian and Canadian people experiencing various forms of, the best case scenario is simply being deported. There was a British woman, I think, who was held for 19 days, so given the discretionary powers of border control officers or border enforcement, I think even checking with the US Embassy is really no protection there. And I've noted that Equality Australia is calling on the Australian website to update its advice to LGBTQI plus travellers. And in their kind of framing of it, they've said anyone who's got an X mark, or anyone whose marker doesn't match their birth identity. But they've also said any queer person engaged in activism or political activity should think twice about traveling, which is more broad again. And I presume as a response to the fact that we've heard accounts of people being sent back or turned away because of what's in their messages or what's in their social media accounts. Or I think the concern is what you can find if you Google someone's name. So Equality Australia is essentially saying that, the Australian government has a responsibility to LGBTQI plus Australians to take this risk seriously and to start updating its travel advice.
Prudence, I do want to go back though, because of course you mentioned reproductive rights and we've had you on the show a number of times to talk about this issue. But as far as I've been following it, there hasn't been heaps in the news about reproductive rights in the Trump administration. But my instincts would say that doesn't mean stuff's not happening.
Your instincts are right. Like there has been kind of silence by and large, but the silence is the point, and you kind of have to be really looking to see what is and isn't happening, because some quite significant things, which we've kind of predicted, have occurred. So one of the things that really stood out to people in the reproductive rights space is that on the eve of Trump's inauguration, the government website, which was run by the Department of Health and Human Services, which was reproductiverights.gov, just vanished. And that website had been basically giving people information about patient rights in the post-Roe v. Wade era. So what is legal? What are your rights around abortion and also birth control? And it has just gone. It's completely gone. In the same way that, for example, now a lot of the websites on the internet that were government websites to do with LGBTQI plus issues are now just LGB. They don't have any information about the other stuff. So suddenly there's this just complete disappearance of the idea of reproductive rights. And then, of course, as soon as Trump comes in, he signs executive orders that reverse Biden's executive orders that had attempted to kind of shore up small elements of reproductive rights. So that's immediately gone. He also pardoned 23 anti-abortion protesters who were in jail for a clinic invasion that had happened. So he does all these things really, really quickly, like even before he's spoken to the March for Life, which happened on the 25th of January, and that's the major anti-abortion rally. So he spoke at it virtually. Vance spoke at it in person. It was Vance's first speech as vice president, and Vance did his pro-natalist anti-abortion thing in that he begins by talking about how he wants to see more babies in America.
So let me say very simply, I want more babies in the United States of America. With the inauguration on Monday, our country faces the return of the most pro-family, most pro-life American president of our lifetimes.
Internationally, they very, very quickly, Marco Rubio, as Secretary of State, announced that the US would be rejoining something called the Geneva Consensus Declaration, which is an international anti-abortion statement that had been crafted in 2020 when Trump and the US kind of led that. And that aligns the US with places like Hungary and Poland, kind of authoritarian light regimes who are hostile to anti-abortion rights. And in the last Trump presidency, the US also formed common cause with groups that were anti to LGBTQI plus rights as well. And that's part of a broader effort to get the UN to not consider reproductive rights as human rights. Like that's part of a big wholesale shift. So you see the US like linking arms with South Sudan and Saudi Arabia when it comes to things like abortion and sexuality. But the other things I think that really didn't attract attention because it was like the ending of something was that the Trump Justice Department almost immediately filed a motion to dismiss what was quite a significant lawsuit that had gone to the Supreme Court and then gone back down to a lower court, which was about Idaho and emergency care for abortion, for people needing emergency access to abortion. So the Biden administration had brought a case against Idaho, which has like one of the strictest laws in the country, where you can really only access abortion for health reasons if the person is at death, and essentially said that federal legislation relating to hospitals required patients to be stabilized if they were experiencing a medical emergency, and that meant abortion care. If you come in having a miscarriage, the hospital has to provide treatment, and that treatment is probably going to be emptying the uterus, so an abortion. And Idaho was saying that was not the case, that they did not have to provide that kind of care. So that, was this kind of long legal process, and then the Justice Department just filed a motion to dismiss it, and now it's completely gone. And this is one of the things that people thought would happen, because Project 2025 outlined that as something that should happen. There's all these things that have been taken away or revoked, and then there's all this activity at the state level which is clearly gearing up to try and get more Supreme Court cases or more cases. So there have been multiple really draconian laws passed at the state level. I think probably the most serious of which are that at least 4 states have passed laws that change the legal definition of homicide to include abortion, which would mean that a person who has an abortion has committed homicide, which is always and would be charged thusly. And so it was always the claim from Right to Lifers that they didn't want to charge the people who had abortions. They only wanted to charge the doctors. That's out the window now. But you also have lots of states that have passed what we call fetal personhood laws or laws with fetal personhood language. And the intention of that is to establish the idea that a fetus is a person as per the 14th Amendment of the Constitution. And if a case like that gets to the Supreme Court and it is upheld, that will make all abortion completely illegal. It won't be a state-by-state matter. And that's been the goal of the anti-abortion movement for a while, but it becomes the paramount goal after Roe v. Wade was overturned. And also, just to give a super grim finale, more grim than the rest, a Georgia woman was arrested last month when she was found bleeding and unconscious after having miscarried a 19-week-old fetus. Those charges were dropped, but she was initially charged with concealing the death of another person and throwing away a dead body because she had put the miscarried fetus in a bin because she didn't know what to do with it, and then she passed out. And that type of arrest is not actually unheard of. We had a similar case in 2023 where an Ohio woman who miscarried at 21 weeks was charged with felony abuse of a corpse. And it's, she was in a situation where the hospitals did not provide her with care because of the law in Ohio. And then she didn't know what to do with the fetus that she had miscarried. So we're having these situations where all kinds of really alarming things are happening below the surface. And I think, again, that's the point. Trump didn't want a big federal battle around these things. And many of the people, the anti-abortion people who support him, what they really want is a Supreme Court case. They don't want a congressional law, which they're never going to have the numbers to get through. They don't have the ability to get an amendment or to pass a law. What they want are more test cases. And the Trump Department of Justice is really primed for all of that.
That is so grim.
Yeah, it is. And in fact, of course, the important thing to note is that people who had miscarriages, there's a kind of a history of particularly women of colour or minority women have been charged for their miscarriages in the past, even before Roe v. Wade was overturned, because they were kind of charged of like abuse of a fetus or, an assumption that they had done something to bring on a miscarriage. But now we're seeing cases where, people like the experience of a medical trauma and emergency is to have someone arrested. Like, it's just unbelievable.
It really is.
We can make Australia great again.
Is that an ode to Donald Trump?
No, if I said that, I don't even realise I said that, but no.
All right, what about Trump's national executive order of only recognising 2 sexes, 2 genders?
Yeah, and I think there's elements of this that come to the core principle of protecting women, and particularly in things like sport.
Prudence, I wanted to ask you about how you think that this is all playing out domestically in Australia. You mentioned Peter Dutton earlier. We've talked about Australians, Australian queer people travelling to the US. How do you see it, that politics, those culture wars impacting Australia, especially given, of course, we're in the middle of a federal election campaign?
I think it's interesting because I think what we've seen is Peter Dutton experiment with culture wars in actually a slightly more sophisticated way than perhaps commentators are giving him credit for. Because yes, there's all the really, I like the way Emma raised her eyebrows. There's all the really overt things, like I won't stand in front of an Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander flag. Australia Day can't be changed. There's all this kind of really upfront stuff, and he's not being subtle about what that is and why he's doing it. But there's some other stuff where he is, I think, creating this interesting distance, but still gesturing towards some of the things that have happened in Trump's America. And one of the things that I found quite irritating in terms of media analysis of this is at the start of the year, I heard a fairly prominent ABC Radio National journalist who prides herself on her political commentary saying that Dutton wouldn't touch a whole bunch of the kind of sexual culture war stuff because they're toxic. And this was, I think, about a week after Queensland had announced its pause on hormone treatment for trans young people. And to think that to make that claim also given the fact that at about the same time, 100 Conservatives, including former Prime Minister Tony Abbott and people like Alex Antic, who's a current senator, and, 100 Conservatives wrote to Albanese demanding an immediate pause on all hormone therapy for people aged under the 18 and an inquiry. Like, to think that that wouldn't happen here and couldn't happen here because it was too toxic seemed to be to define culture wars in the most myopic way. And I think what Dutton's done, which is disturbing but really interesting, is he's kind of allowed, or he's had proxies do the work for him, and then he distances himself from that. So
which is very Trumpian.
It is Trumpian. And it could actually be, some of that I think is more complicated than I'm making it sound. So the example I'm thinking of where I think he's doing the work of nodding to it and then disavowing it is about that at the start of the year, the Nationals leader, David Littleproud, suggested that basically Conservatives, but Dutton should lean into gender stuff because of all Trump's executive orders. So basically Trump signed all the anti-trans executive orders and the Nationals were like, people want to have this conversation, let's do it. And Dutton shut it down, says LNP doesn't have any plans to change our position. But simultaneously, in the same moment, he also accused the Albanese government of being interested in pronouns and of wasting money on the Voice campaign. And it's that language around pronouns that's doing the work. So yeah, okay, so he's not saying he's interested in going all in on trans women in sport, but he is saying pronouns, and he is using that kind of wokest language that Trump was using throughout his campaign in really targeted ways. The other thing I think is really interesting, and this is one where I think Dutton didn't have control of the situation, came last year around abortion when there was the whole blow up in Queensland around abortion in the state election when Robbie Katter of Katter Australia Party announced that he would move a bill to overturn decriminalised abortion. And several federal politicians, including Jacinta Price, who I think is essentially Dutton's Trump proxy, and I think that's by design. Yeah. Jacinta Price suddenly gave an interview announcing that she opposed all abortion after 3 months when she'd never really talked about the issue before. And a couple of other figures indicated that they thought the federal party should start getting in on abortion. And Dutton was very clear that he did not want to talk about this issue. He really shut it down within the party room. He essentially said that the LNP had won a narrower victory in Queensland than it should have because of the abortion issue, very clearly framed it as a distraction. And I think what was interesting there is you see people like Matt Canavan, who's very, very anti-abortion, really fall in line. And I think that's one where Dutton genuinely did not want to have a conversation about abortion, particularly in a moment where abortion's everywhere. He did not want to be positioning himself with Trump on abortion. And I think that was a really interesting thing where his hand was forced to intervene there, because when New South Wales decriminalised abortion, Dutton did make comments about not agreeing with abortion after 22 weeks. He did kind of insert himself into that discussion, which was odd because he didn't seem to do that when Queensland, his actual home state, did that kind of decriminalisation process. So when New South Wales decriminalised in 2019, Dutton made some, what turned out to feel like relatively mild interventions compared to what Barnaby Joyce and Tony Abbott did. But he did put himself into that conversation when really there was no need for him to be part of that.
Yeah, I think one of the really notable things about this election campaign is the way Trump is exposing some of those internal ideological tensions in kind of the broader conservative movement in Australia.
Yes. And this idea that Trump, for some of them, they think that the problem, and for some of those conservatives, I think they would think that the problem Dutton is experiencing is because he's shying away from that. So shying away from going full Trump, but really embracing what's out there. So there's this kind of way, and there's a group of them that clearly think that Trump is a ticket to victory. But I think Dutton has all kind of gone to Trump as it is, and it's kind of backfired for him because Trump, I think, is politically poisonous in most other countries, particularly countries such as ourselves with with compulsory voting. So you can't necessarily go too far in either extreme. I do think the decision to say that we needed a Department of Government, the Doge here, I think it was a huge misstep. I think there are a few things that Dutton's done in relation to the culture wars that have been too associated with Trump and are kind of perceived as toxic. But then there are other little things he did, which I think, again, have kind of flown under the radar. So supposedly when he and his staff visited the Head Start office to announce kind of a mental health for youth grant, It's alleged that his campaign staff went in and removed any LGBTQI plus flags or materials in a Head Start office. And, you know, Head Start is an inclusive space and had all of that kind of stuff, but he didn't want to be photographed in relation to those materials. I mean, some of that stuff is really interesting. So he's not saying that he's opposed to those groups or those causes, but he is very clearly making sure that he's not visually associated with them for the people for whom those issues work to activate them.
Yeah, and I mean, I think it remains to be seen how that plays out. I think you're absolutely right about that. A lot of that being toxic in the Australian context, partly because the second Trump administration is so extreme and so radical, you know, that is there isn't a constituency, or there's not a huge constituency for that in Australia. But it's likely to get a fair bit more cringy, and hopefully we can have you back afterwards to analyse how some of it went. But until then, Prudence, thank you so much for your time and your generosity.
No worries. Thanks for having me.
Before you go, we'd love to get your thoughts on the show. You can send us feedback as well as episode and guest ideas to our email address, podcasts@australiainstitute.org.au. This episode was recorded on Thursday, the 17th of April. I'm sure some stuff will have changed since then. After America is supported by the Andrew Farron Foundation and produced by Angus Blackman. We'll be back next week. I'm Emma Shortis. Thanks for listening.